Inside Canada's Parliament, the atmosphere was electric. Questions flew across the chamber, but only one issue mattered: the future of the Brampton auto workers.
3,000 auto workers in Brampton learned that the Prime Minister had sold them out and failed them in negotiations with the United States of America. $15 billion, tax dollars, to the company that is moving their jobs south. So, surely the government would have negotiated a jobs guarantee for every single Canadian Stellantis employee. Will they release that guarantee and the entire contract so Canadians know where their dollars went?
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre demanded answers after Stellantis announced its plan to move production from Ontario to Illinois, taking roughly 3,000 jobs south of the border. The debate was more than a political skirmish. It became a reflection of a country struggling to protect its industrial identity in a turbulent North American economy.
Mr. Speaker, of course, what Stellantis announced for the Brampton plant last week was completely unacceptable. And Stellantis has made solemn commitments to this government and to their workers, and they need to honor their commitment. An hour ago, I met here in Ottawa with the head of Canadian Stellantis, with the head of Unifor, and also with the Minister of Economic Development of Ontario. We're one strong team, Canada, and we will make sure that these jobs stay in Brampton.
While Poilievre accused the government of wasting 15 billion Canadian dollars in subsidies, Mélanie Joly stood her ground. She emphasized that Ottawa, Ontario, and the unions were united as Team Canada. Behind her calm tone was a message that resonated beyond politics. This was about defending Canada's sovereignty in the face of American economic pressure. She reminded Parliament that Stellantis had received millions in public support to retool the Brampton plant, money that came from Canadian taxpayers. The company had made clear promises to invest and build new models there. Now, with production shifting to Illinois, Joly vowed to hold Stellantis accountable under its legal and financial commitments. Her focus was not on partisan blame, but on ensuring that Canadian workers were protected. By the end of the debate, the lines were drawn. The Conservatives framed the crisis as a government failure. The Carney administration framed it as a national fight against unfair U.S. tariffs. That confrontation in Ottawa was only the surface of a much larger story, one that began long before the parliamentary shouting started.
For decades, Brampton's auto plant symbolized Canada's industrial strength. Generations of workers built vehicles there for Chrysler, Fiat, and later Stellantis. It wasn't just an assembly line, it was a source of identity, community, and middle-class stability. So when the announcement came in October 2025 that Stellantis would relocate Jeep Compass production to Illinois, it hit like a national earthquake. Across Ontario, the news spread through factory floors, union halls, and local diners. For many, it was more than the loss of 3,000 jobs. It was the erosion of something deeply Canadian, the belief that the nation could compete with the United States in manufacturing excellence. Newspapers and talk shows called it a betrayal of Canadian industry. What had seemed like a corporate decision quickly turned into a political turning point. Canada's industrial pride had been tested, and its leaders were under pressure to prove that the nation could stand on its own against the weight of Trump's economic power.
Stellantis' decision was not made in isolation. It reflected the growing pressure on global automakers caught between Trump's tariff walls and the economics of North American supply chains. The company's $13 billion U.S. investment was announced as a reshoring win, adding 5,000 jobs in Illinois. The White House celebrated it as proof that tariffs worked. Yet economists quickly pointed out a contradiction. By punishing Canada, the United States' closest trading partner, Washington disrupted the very network that made North American manufacturing competitive. The integrated auto industry depended on cross-border parts and logistics refined through decades of cooperation under the 1994 NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Trump's tariffs didn't just pressure foreign competitors, they fractured that network. Canadian-made engines, batteries, and electronics that once flowed easily across the border now faced delays, higher costs, and legal disputes over domestic content. The short-term result looked like a win for Trump: more jobs on U.S. soil and a symbolic political victory heading into the 2026 USMCA review. But the long-term reality was far more uncertain. Supply chains became costlier, U.S. automakers faced retaliation from trading partners, and Canada, rather than retreating, began to transform its industrial strategy. What was meant to weaken Ottawa's leverage had the opposite effect. Canada started pushing for deeper cooperation with Mexico, expanding electric vehicle partnerships in Quebec and British Columbia, and exploring European and Asian markets to diversify exports. Trump's tariffs had triggered the very independence they were designed to suppress.
At the heart of this crisis lies something larger than trade numbers. The auto industry represents a century of Canadian industrial pride. In 2009, when Chrysler, now Stellantis, was collapsing, Ottawa stepped in with rescue funding to keep the company alive. Canadian taxpayers kept those assembly lines running. 16 years later, the same company's withdrawal felt like history in reverse. For Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, the issue was no longer just about Stellantis. It was about national credibility. If foreign corporations could take public money, break commitments, and shift jobs south under U.S. pressure, what did that mean for Canada's sovereignty? In response, Ottawa launched a coordinated plan. The federal and Ontario governments began reviewing investment contracts to ensure stronger job retention clauses. Financial support for automakers was now tied to long-term employment guarantees. Unifor, the National Auto Union, secured talks to extend worker benefits until 2027. The message was clear: Canada would not fund corporations that abandoned Canadian workers. Meanwhile, Joly and her team intensified diplomacy in Washington, pressing for exemptions to the 25% auto tariff and for recognition of Canada's role in North America's electric vehicle supply chain. Behind closed doors, officials argued that integrated production was not a threat, but a strength for the entire continent. This moment marked a turning point. Trump's pressure campaign had forced Canada to think differently, to see industrial policy not as dependency on American demand, but as a foundation of economic sovereignty. The government's response, though defensive at first, began to evolve into something more assertive: a vision of a self-sustaining Canadian manufacturing base capable of standing beside the United States, not beneath it.
In the months after the Stellantis announcement, both nations drew lessons from the fallout. The U.S. celebrated the Illinois jobs as proof that America First was working. But industry data told a different story. The Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association found that supply chain disruptions and duplicated costs had raised vehicle prices in North America by nearly 8% since the tariff wave began in 2025. In Canada, the shock turned into resolve. Investment in electric vehicle battery plants surged, with Ontario and Quebec attracting around $12 billion in new commitments by late 2025. Instead of retreating, Canadian policymakers adapted, using the crisis to rebuild industrial strength. Trump had aimed to dominate North American manufacturing through tariffs and pressure. What emerged instead was a more determined neighbor that refused to be defined by Washington's agenda. Mélanie Joly's message now echoes nationwide. Canada's leaders and workers were shaken but united. Sovereignty is not granted by trade deals, it is earned through persistence. As the U.S. prepares for new trade talks in 2026, it faces a Canada that is stronger and unwilling to play second in the North American hierarchy. Trump's policy brought a short-term win, but it also sparked a long-term awakening. Canada's industrial pride was tested, yet it endures. From Parliament to Brampton's silent assembly lines, one conviction now defines the nation. The fight for Canadian industry is not over, and this time, Canada intends to win.
U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war has prompted a frantic search for new markets for Canadian trade.
I think that Canada would be very wise to start negotiating what China is putting on the table now. We keep talking about the fact that we've got to have new trading routes, new trading partners after what's happened with the Americans.
It began quietly, with a series of small but deliberate steps. While Washington doubled down on new tariffs and threats against Canada's auto sector, Beijing did something few expected. It extended an open hand. China offered to ease restrictions on Canadian agriculture, to welcome energy and minerals, and even to discuss joint opportunities in the fast-growing electric vehicle market. For decades, Canada's trade story revolved around its southern neighbor. Nearly 3/4 of its exports still travel across the border to the United States. But when President Donald Trump renewed his campaign of pressure, raising duties on metals, furniture, and now vehicles, Ottawa began to realize that relying on one market had become a vulnerability. In that moment, Canada didn't retaliate loudly. It changed direction. Trump's hardline strategy, meant to force Canada into submission, is now pushing it toward a new path, one that leads east toward China. The spark came from the auto industry. In early October, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told a Toronto audience that when it comes to vehicle production, it is America first, Canada second. His words carried the weight of Trump's new tariff threat, a 25% tax on cars and parts entering the U.S. from Canada. For Ontario, this was not just rhetoric, it was an existential problem. About 500,000 jobs in southern Ontario depend on the auto supply chain, which is deeply integrated with factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Each vehicle assembled in Canada includes roughly 50% U.S.-made parts. Any disruption in that chain hurts both sides of the border. By the time Lutnick's comments made headlines, investors were already nervous. Ottawa's Trade Department estimated that a prolonged 25% tariff could cut Canada's annual auto exports by tens of billions of dollars and trigger layoffs across steel, aluminum, and manufacturing. Even in the U.S., analysts warned that the policy would raise production costs for American automakers. Yet, Trump showed no sign of backing down. His message was clear: production should move south no matter the cost. And that was the moment Canada began looking elsewhere for stability.
And what did we get in return from the Americans for putting ourselves in lockstep with them, for backing them up on their 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? We got slapped with our own tariffs. That's how Donald Trump plays the game.
I have said multiple times, if Canada is ready to correct these practices, China will also respond accordingly.
While Washington was building barriers, Beijing was sending signals. Chinese officials opened discussions about renewed agricultural imports and potential cooperation in clean tech manufacturing. For Canada, still facing China's tariffs on canola imposed in previous years, it was a sign of thawing relations. According to trade analysts interviewed by CTV News, China's proposal was straightforward. Canada could reopen its market to Chinese electric vehicles, most priced between $35,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars, and in return, Beijing would ease restrictions on Canadian farm exports. The idea was practical. Canadian consumers would gain access to affordable EVs, while farmers would regain access to a market of 1.4 billion people. The timing was no coincidence. Trump's 100% tariff on Chinese electric cars had effectively locked China out of the American market. Beijing was searching for a G7 partner willing to engage, and Canada's strained ties with Washington created that opportunity. Inside Ottawa, officials saw both risk and leverage. Canada could diversify trade while reminding the United States that loyalty cannot be one-sided. China was not replacing the U.S., but it was offering something Trump had taken away: a choice. By mid-October, Canada's shift was visible in both policy and tone. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government increased funding for domestic manufacturing, steel, and energy. The Federal Finance Ministry confirmed new support programs to offset losses from U.S. tariffs, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly called for stronger protection of auto workers. At the same time, Ottawa kept its diplomatic language measured. It lifted certain retaliatory tariffs to encourage dialogue with Washington, but it held firm on a 25% levy for U.S. vehicles entering Canada. That single policy sent a clear message: Canada was willing to talk, but not to yield. Officials close to the trade file described the strategy as sectoral resilience. Instead of chasing one massive free trade agreement, Canada pursued smaller, industry-specific arrangements on steel, aluminum, agriculture, and potentially electric vehicles, with partners beyond the U.S. border. Beijing's outreach fit naturally into that framework. Canada's auto suppliers and EV battery producers were already exploring Asia for investment, while Chinese companies sought access to critical minerals like nickel and lithium from northern Ontario. For both sides, cooperation looked less like defiance and more like common sense. As one senior Canadian diplomat put it in a televised interview, the goal is no longer to depend on any single partner, but to build a network of equals. Trump's threats only accelerated that mindset. For the United States, the ripple effects are becoming clear. Trump's tariffs were designed to rebuild U.S. industry, but they are instead inflating costs and alienating allies. Data from the U.S. Department of Commerce show that steel and aluminum prices have climbed nearly 20% since early 2025. Vehicle prices are rising, and manufacturers are warning of lower profits. In the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, factories that depend on cross-border trade are struggling with shortages of Canadian parts. Economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago recently reported that every 10% increase in tariff costs reduces Midwest manufacturing output by roughly 2%. Meanwhile, Canada's exploration of Chinese markets signals something Washington has long feared: that America's closest trading partner can function without it. Instead of isolating China, the White House has driven a wedge into North America's economic core. The more Trump insists on control, the less control he actually has. Canada's pivot toward China is not an act of rebellion. It is a lesson in adaptation. Faced with tariffs on steel, aluminum, softwood, and now vehicles, Ottawa did not surrender or retaliate blindly. It moved with quiet precision, securing new options for its economy and protecting its workers. The results are beginning to surface. Exports to Asian markets are slowly expanding. Talks with China are ongoing. And within Canada, the idea of depending solely on the United States is losing its appeal. Trump's campaign to dominate trade has exposed a deeper truth: influence cannot be enforced by threats. While Washington measures power in tariffs, Canada is learning to measure it in choices. If Ottawa and Beijing continue to align, America could lose more than contracts and factories. It could lose the trust that once defined its leadership. The tariff war Trump started was meant to make America strong again. But the calm, calculated response from Canada may be what truly reshapes the future of North American trade. In the middle of harvest season, farmers in Canada depend on heavy combines that cost millions of dollars and keep their operations alive. For decades, many of those machines came from a factory in Omaha, Nebraska. But this year, a major shift occurred.
Claus is one of several companies that has primarily sold to farmers in the prairies. The company has long built its machines in Nebraska, but it's moving its Canadian production to Germany as a strategic response to the current trade climate.
Claus, one of the world's largest combine manufacturers, announced it will no longer produce its Canadian-bound machines in the United States. Instead, production is being moved to Harswinkel, Germany. The reason is not technical, and it is not about product quality. It is about trade policy. By exporting from Germany, Claus can use the Canada-EU trade agreement that eliminates most tariffs. By exporting from the United States, the company would face the uncertainty of new duties. A policy designed to bring production back to America has pushed it away.
When President Trump returned to office in 2025, he launched a new wave of tariffs. The White House argued that higher duties would force multinational firms to produce more inside the United States. The goal was to reduce reliance on imports and to create jobs for American workers. Yet the case of Claus shows how the logic is breaking down. Because Canada and the European Union already have a free trade deal, it is cheaper and safer for the company to serve Canadian customers from Germany. According to the European Commission, CETA has cut tariffs on more than 98% of goods between Canada and the EU since 2017. That framework gives a German-made combine a clear advantage over one shipped from Omaha. The contradiction is striking. Shipping a machine across the Atlantic is now more cost-effective than moving it across the border into Saskatoon. Instead of drawing factories into the United States, tariffs are pushing them out.
What's basically happening is firms that have operations in both the US and in Europe are sidestepping the entire issue of tariffs by saying we'll just produce for the Canadian market in a country that doesn't have a tariff dispute.
Experts warn that CLA may be only the beginning. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as CUSMA, is scheduled for renegotiation in 2026. That uncertainty makes it harder for firms to invest in long-term supply chains. Companies want stable rules, and when they do not find them in America, they look elsewhere. In this environment, Canada quietly benefits. Farmers in Saskatchewan will still get the equipment they need. They will pay prices shaped by European trade preferences rather than American tariffs. Ottawa has not had to spend political capital to achieve this. Instead, it is leveraging existing agreements like CETA and expanding new ones, such as the economic partnership signed with Indonesia in September 2025. By keeping its doors open, Canada positions itself as a steady partner, while the United States becomes less predictable. The contrast is simple. Washington raises barriers while Ottawa finds new pathways.
The move, experts say, may lead to more companies relocating in the future.
And if it's cheaper to send across an ocean rather than send it across a heavily tariffed border, that's what they'll do.
The outcome is a lesson in unintended consequences. The Trump administration promised to restore American manufacturing strength, but the first visible effect is a major company shifting Canadian production to Europe. That means fewer jobs and less investment in Nebraska. It means more confidence for Canada's trading partners and more reliance on agreements that exclude the United States. The pattern could repeat itself in other sectors. Pharmaceuticals, autos, and lumber are already subject to new duties announced in late September 2025. If more firms conclude that it is easier to move production abroad than to navigate a tariff-heavy border, the loss will deepen. What was meant to rebuild America risks hollowing it out. Trade policy is not only about protection. It is about building an environment where businesses can plan with certainty. Without that certainty, the backfire is almost inevitable, and Canada is left collecting the gains.